I've watched institutions, large institutions, including corporations, devolve and die. And it happens gradually, then suddenly. And I think this is how psychopathology develops in people too. You hit a point where a positive feedback loop of some sort develops. And you kind of pointed to that, I think. So you imagine that as the number of radical left-wing professors increases, the cost of not being one of them increases. And then it increases to the point where anyone who isn't someone like that, who has options, leaves because they can. And then the people who are left are either incompetent and can't leave, or are the radicals themselves. Well, this happens in companies all the time. If a company has a bad quarter or two, often the 10% of people who are hyperproductive leave because they can. And then the company's in desperate straits almost immediately, even though it may still have most of its employees. Okay, so there's that. And then the other comment I would make that's horrible, really, it's a horrible observation, is that, I mean, are we really at the place where the institutions of higher education that were supposed to function not only to educate young people, but also to act to some degree as intellectual stewards of the political, economic, social, and psychological environments, let's say, they've abdicated their responsibility. They've become so irresponsible and so corrupt that they actually can't do that anymore. Like, one of the things I've been wondering, I've been contemplating the reality of the rot at universities. And one of the things you have to ask yourself, when many large institutions of the same type rot all at the same time, you have to ask yourself whether or not the reason that they're rotting, the simplest reason that they're rotting is because they're dead. They're actually dead and they're not savable. And I kind of think that might be the case, because I've tried to think through how you could save them. But you can imagine, here's the situation. They're way too expensive. They're way too centralized. They're way too dependent on government money. They're way too radical in their thinking. There's far too many administrators. And that's enough. That's like six terrible problems. And my experience watching large organizations fail is that if they have two major problems, they're done. And I think academia has six. And I can't even hypothesize how well. And then you add to this, one final observation would be, the younger the professor, given everything we've said, the more likely they are to be radical in their orientation. And that means the longer their tenure as tenured professors before the scales might be rebalanced. And so I can't even think. You left and you started acting in a more political way, and you said you had some personal reasons for that, including the fact that you didn't think you should be a political actor as a professor. But do you see, like, I can't imagine that you're happy to see the demise of these great institutions. I mean, if we lose Oxford and Cambridge, for example, that's a complete bloody catastrophe. But do you see a way forward?
I think they're gone. I really think they're gone. And I've had this debate with many friends and colleagues of mine, much more successful academics than me. I mean, people I really respect, historian Neil Ferguson, among others. And, the way they talk about academia in the 80s and 90s is something I don't personally recognize from my experience. I think the universities, the legacy universities, Jordan, are gone. Donors constantly say to me, well, I'm going to buy or invest in an Oxford college and I'm going to reform it. Well, you and I both know as disillusioned academics, that the moment that collides with the reality of the ecosystem of higher education, the ethics committees, the research councils, the bureaucracy, you and I both know what will happen. Any attempt to reform the legacy universities will get tied up immediately in paperwork and ideological motivations. That's what's going to happen.
Yeah, well, we also didn't add to the panoply of problems the fact that the research journals themselves have been captured and corrupted. Academics have to pay to publish in them. They have libraries over the barrel. They charge them an arm and a leg completely inappropriately, and they put everything that researchers write behind a paywall. And then it takes 2 years to publish. Like, that's insane. In a world where you can write something and publish it to an international audience in one day, the fact that it takes 2 years to publish a peer-reviewed article, it means that you're stuck in like 1830. If that. It's terrible.
Well, absolutely. But there are also ideological scams. And that's when I became very disillusioned. I watched the grievance studies hoax play out, whereby, clearly fraudulent papers were submitted to social justice journals and then revealed to have been authored by, Peter Boghossian, Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay. I watched the Michael LeCoeur scandal, whereby a researcher had claimed that a randomized controlled trial involving gay canvassers talking to voters face to face made them more supportive of same-sex marriage. It turned out he had fabricated his data, but that was accepted without question by the most prestigious journals in academia. I saw the Roland Fryer scandal at Harvard. The nightmare that he had to go through to publish a finding that challenged the orthodoxy on campus. In that case, that African Americans were not more likely to be killed by police. And I was just watching one scandal after another and just realizing, the whole thing is rotten. The industry, the sector that I'm working in, it needs root and branch reform. So I left, and I think in many ways for me, the universities, at least in the UK, are really a symbol of a much deeper rot that has set in into our culture and into our civilization. The institutions, the public sector, taxpayer-funded institutions have become politicized. They've become deeply corrupt. They've become utterly disconnected from the vast majority of ordinary people in this country, and they have been imposing top-down a political agenda on everybody else that is really supported by only about 10 to 15% of radical progressives within Western populations. And that is what I've seen, not just in universities, but within government departments, within Westminster, within the civil service, within the federal state bureaucracy. I think people are sick of it. I think they can see this for what it is, which is political indoctrination.